in the workforce at all. In other words, they're not looking for work. They don't have a job, and they're not looking for work. So again, this idea that the job growth engine has slowed down, this is a pattern that we see in a lot of the evidence. The other part of the pattern is that the jobs that we are generating are not the same as the ones we were generating in the past. In the decades after the end of World War II, as I said earlier, the countries of Europe and North America generated a wonderful, large, stable, prosperous middle class, and we generated a lot of middle class jobs. What we're noticing over the past couple decades is that we're doing, in some countries, a pretty good job of generating jobs up at the high end, jobs for top-level managers, for executives, for technologists, for professionals like doctors and lawyers. We still need those. We're also doing a pretty good job of generating low-end jobs, jobs like a cook in a restaurant or a gardener or a night watchman in a factory, things like that. We're still generating those. What's been happening, though, is that the middle, this classic middle class, has been getting hollowed out, and the jobs have been heading in both directions, up and down. Unfortunately, as we look at the evidence, it seems that we're doing a better job of creating jobs down at the low end than up at the high end. And that helps explain why the average incomes in most countries in North America and Europe have flattened out. They're not increasing anymore. And by some measures, they're actually going down slowly over time. So we have a job creation challenge, and we have a job quality challenge. We have a job and a wage challenge. And that's been the fairly clear pattern over the past 15 to 20 years. It has accelerated since the end of the Great Recession. Since 2008, 2009, these patterns have become more clear and more visible in the evidence. The second question is, what's likely to happen in the future? And to understand that and to try to answer that question, we have to understand why that pattern has been going on for the past 15 or 20 years. And there are several explanations for what's been happening to jobs and wages around the world. And they have to do with globalization. Some people believe that opening up trade around the world is a big contributor. Some people believe that the nature of capitalism itself has changed, and that essentially capitalism has been hijacked by, we hear about the 1%, or the 1% of the 1%. We hear that the economies have become financialized and the banks are perverting the rest of the system. There are a number of explanations going on. The one that I want to concentrate on, and the one that I think is a major contributor to what's happening, is technological progress. And very simply, as digital technologies can do more and more, we need human labor to do less and less. So I believe that the two major forces that are reshaping economies around the world and changing jobs and wages, particularly in rich countries like America and Belgium, the two major forces are globalization and technological progress. And of those two, I think technological progress has been underappreciated. I also think it's only going to become more powerful as we move into the future for reasons that I'm going to talk about. So what do I mean by technological progress? It's simply the notion that as we build more and more capable digital technologies, the need for different kinds of human labor diminishes. And historically, technology has not been able to do very many of the things that a person can do. Historically, technology was never able to listen to speech like this, understand what I'm saying, understand what I want, and give it to me. Our computers, our digital technologies were pretty lousy at pattern matching, at picking out subtle patterns from huge amounts of information. And our digital technologies were pretty bad at dealing with very dynamic, very fluid, very fast-changing situations. So if you had a task that didn't change very much over time, was pretty simple to describe, and you could just execute it over and over again, we already gave those jobs to technology. We've been doing that for decades. So if you go look around a modern factory today, you don't see very many people, because that work is very routine. We gave that routine physical work to technology. If you go look in the offices of a manufacturing company, you really don't see very many people anymore, because all the clerks who are responsible for inventory and accounting and jobs like that, we've given those jobs to technology as well. So the question is that pattern going to continue? And the reason I believe it is going to continue and that it's actually going to accelerate is because we now have technologies, and this is a very recent development. It's only a few years old. We now have technologies that can do all those things that technology could never do before, and therefore we used to need human beings for it. Technologies exist today that can understand speech just like I'm saying it now, accurately transcribe it, figure out if there's a question or a request in that, and then satisfy that request. We have technologies that are amazingly good at pattern matching. I believe, for example, that if the world's best medical diagnostician today is not a piece of technology, it will be fairly soon. And one of the most remarkable triumphs that I saw recently was the victory of an artificial intelligence, a machine learning system, over the human champion in the strategy game of Go. The human champion played a 5-game match against a Go playing piece of software in Korea in March of this year, and the technology won 4 games to 1. The reason that is particularly important is that there is no human being who can explain how to play Go at a very high level. And that sounds like a completely ridiculous statement. After all, there are human beings playing Go at a very high level. The problem is they can't explain how they do what they do. This problem was really beautifully summarized by a philosopher named Michael Polanyi of the last century. He said, "We know more than we can tell." And when you look around at high-level human abilities in lots of different domains, you see this phenomenon over and over again, that the person cannot explain how they do what they do, what strategies they're following, what rules they're following. Now, in the old world, this used to mean that there was a hard barrier on the kinds of work that we could give to technology, the kinds of work that we could automate. If nobody could explain the rules, we could not program those rules into software. What's different now, and what we learned from that victory of a Go playing piece of software over the human Go champion, is that we are now able to build technologies that can learn on their own. This is the field of machine learning that we hear about. And we have the ability now, we've demonstrated the ability to build technologies where if you show it enough examples, and the Go playing software was given 2,500 years worth of high-level Go games. If you give these technologies enough examples, they will understand the patterns, they will understand the productive rules and the strategies themselves. They don't need to be taught by a human being anymore. This is a big difference. We have not been here before. This is a very recent development, and we don't know exactly what the implications are going to be. But what I see as I look into the future is technology acquiring human level, or even in many cases, superhuman level abilities in jobs that used to belong to human beings alone. Jobs that involve pattern matching, jobs that involve very complex kinds of communication, jobs that involve more fluid, more fuzzy and more dynamic kinds of reasoning. And all of these technologies are coming into the economy more quickly than we thought 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. As we've gone around and done research for our books and for our other work, I've noticed the same phenomenon over and over again, which is the technologists themselves, the people who are developing these new tools, keep on saying to me, I was not expecting progress this fast. We just see it happen over and over more quickly than we were expecting. There were articles written in 2014 and 2015, for example, saying that the Go champion supercomputer was probably at least a decade away. Here we are in 2016. We have that technology now. I got a ride in one of Google's autonomous cars in 2012, and I thought it was an amazing experience. I went for a test drive in a Tesla electric car last month. That car will drive itself completely autonomously down the highway. So 4 years later, we went from kind of a laboratory or a really high-end demonstration to a commercially available technology. I just want to reinforce this notion that technological progress is fast. It's faster than most of us believed even 5 years ago, and I believe it's still accelerating. So we're going to see a lot of new technologies come into the economy. We're going to see a lot of technology taking over tasks and jobs that used to belong to human beings. So what's the right response to this kind of situation? The first thing to say is that the wrong response is to try to stop or slow down the pace of technological progress. Economists say that technological progress is the only free lunch that we believe in. Technological progress makes us richer, makes our economies more abundant, allows us to have better quality lives, better health care. It's a wonderful gift to our lives and to our economies. So the last thing we want to do is try to stop or slow down technological progress. So what's the right way to think about smart policies and smart moves for this future that we're creating? I think we need to keep two things in mind. The first is that nobody is in charge of the economy. I talk to a lot of people who say, well, we just need to do the following three things and that will fix all of these job and wage problems. I wish it were that simple. Our economies are incredibly uncontrolled, decentralized places. The government is one big actor in the economy, so we can put in place policies that take us in the right direction or the wrong direction, but we need to give up this idea or this philosophy that we have some kind of centralized control over the future, over the pace of technological progress, or over how the economy is going to proceed into the future. The second thing that I want to stress is that with the decisions that we make and with the policies that we put in place, we have, I think, a fairly clear choice. We can try to protect the future from the past, or we can try to protect the past from the future. And I think it's a really easy choice. I want to protect the future from the forces of the past because I believe the future that we're creating is a more prosperous, more abundant future. However, when I look around, I see a lot of attempts to protect the past from the future. And what I mean by that is I see a lot of attempts to protect the incumbents, to protect the people who are already there. And by incumbents, I mean the companies who are already dominating in a market. We all know that they can very often try to put in place laws and regulations and policies that benefit them and stop the disruption, stop the turbulence in their particular markets, and try to preserve their position. At the same time, I see a lot of efforts to try to protect the people who have jobs today. And I understand that impulse. It's a very, very logical impulse. In a time when jobs are under threat, the temptation is there to try to protect the people who already have jobs. The problem is, it's not going to work very well. And it's an example of trying to protect the past from the future. If we take the other approach and we try to protect the future from the past, the main thing that we do is we try to let the engine of the free market, the engine of the economy, do what it has done pretty well for 200 years, which is make us wealthier overall and generate jobs, generate wages. And if we're not happy with how that's going, if we think that job growth isn't high enough, if we think that wage growth isn't high enough, I believe our job is to try to get out of the way, remove some of the barriers, remove some of the obstructions to entrepreneurship and innovation and dynamism, and let the engine do what it does. Now, if all that happens, and we're still not happy, if we've done our best efforts, and we're still not happy with the pace of job growth or wage growth, then we know that there are things we can do to help workers out, to help people out. One of my favorite policies is something we're discussing in the United States right now, which we call the earned income tax credit or the negative income tax. And what that means is if you're a worker and you're offering your skills to the economy, but because of whatever factors, you don't have a great wage, the economy does not value that work enough to let you support a lifestyle and a family, great. Let's use taxation, let's use policy to increase your income a little bit. The reason I believe that in policies like that is I have concluded, based on my research, based on the research of a lot of other people, that work is a really important thing for an individual and for a community. I always go back to a quote that came from one of the great sages of the European Enlightenment, Voltaire, who said that work saves us from three great evils: boredom, vice, and need. And when I look around at the communities where work has gone away, I see a lot of social problems. I think it's responsible for a lot of the social ills that we see. So because of all of this, I'm a big fan of people having jobs, work, the dignity, the values, the connections that come along with that. So what I want to do with our policies going forward is, again, remove the barriers, remove the restrictions to innovation and entrepreneurship, and try to put in place as many direct incentives, as much encouragement as possible for people to get out there, to be involved in the labor force, to be involved in the economy, and to keep offering their labor. Because the robots are not about to take all the jobs in the next 5 years, even the next 10 years. So I don't think that's the future that we need to be preparing for right now. We need to be preparing for a future where technology is racing ahead, and we need to increase the speed of our other institutions to keep up with technology. The last thing that I want to say to this audience, and again, thank you for allowing me to join you today. The last thing that I want to say to this audience is that we should be optimistic about the future that we're building. It is a future of greater prosperity, of greater material abundance, of better health, of higher quality lives. We know these things are coming because of technological progress. Our homework and our job in this world that we're creating so quickly is to think about what our values are as people, as members of a society, and make sure that those values are reflected in the policy choices. The technologies are not going to dictate our values. Our values need to be dictating what kind of world, what kind of society we create. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor McAfee, for these challenging thoughts. I might have two questions. I noticed that you haven't used the word factory once. Should we forget about traditional industry then?
We shouldn't forget about traditional industry, but we should walk away from the notion that it is going to be a source of lots of jobs going forward. I'll talk about America for a second. People talk about the decline of manufacturing in America. That's not accurate. America is a manufacturing powerhouse. We have a bigger and bigger manufacturing industry when you measure it by output every year. However, we have a smaller and smaller number of people employed in manufacturing every year. It's a productivity story. We have lots of output with less and less labor over time. So the idea that we're going to restore employment by bringing lots of manufacturing back into North America and Europe, it's just not going to happen. We should support manufacturing like we should support all other kinds of productive activity. But factories are not going to be big buildings full of lots of middle-class workers in Belgium or America, or in another couple generations, even in China. The robots are going to work more cheaply than the workers everywhere in the world before too much longer.
Okay, and then one more question, Professor. You say government is a big actor. It has to remove the barriers and try to protect the future from the past. Now, from your view, is Europe doing a good job at this, or does this image of Europe lagging behind, is that correct?
I think Europe is doing a great job in some things. In particular, I like some of the social safety net policies that I see in Europe, where we don't think that the poor or the people without work are bad or they're lazy and therefore they deserve to be left behind. That's not the philosophy that I see in Europe. And this notion that I get more often when I visit Europe, that we're all in this together and we need to decide our values as a community, I like that a lot. On the other hand, I do see more efforts to protect the past from the future. And this is just my impression. I see more efforts to protect incumbent companies. I see more efforts to protect incumbent job holders. And I just think that what that's going to yield is a shrinking, a pool of people and jobs and prosperity, an island of that that shrinks over time and more people excluded from that kind of participation. I just don't think that's a smart approach in this world that we're creating so quickly.
Okay, clear message to remember. Thanks again, Professor McAfee. Thank you.
Very
So now from Boston, we move on to New York. It will be a telephone line, and we go to Derek Thompson. On this picture, you can see that Derek is still a young man, but he is already a senior editor at The Atlantic magazine. And you should really check him out. You can read his blogs or his articles online. I give you some of the titles. The last one was Donald Trump and the Twilight of White America. Another article was Facebook and Fear, or Budweiser will call its beer America through the election, and the mystery of why black Americans are living longer. So it's a big range of articles. And Derek, I think you can hear me.
I can hear you, yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Good afternoon or good day to you. Welcome.
Good day.
And thanks for joining us. First of all, Derek, what is The Atlantic magazine, in fact?
The Atlantic magazine is a national magazine of politics and culture and economics, and I write mostly about economics and politics for them.
Okay. You've heard Professor McAfee, I think?
I did, yes.
Yeah,
I watched the speech. It was great.
What do you think about his story?
I largely agree with Andrew. I think he's done a lot of wonderful work in this space, and it has inspired a lot of my work in this space. In particular, I appreciate the fact that he is duly optimistic with a small hint of pessimism. And I say that because I do think that technological change and technological development on the whole makes the world a better place. It makes people richer, it makes our lives better, and it overall makes people happier. At the same time, I do think that responsible government policies are required to make sure that the prosperity created by technological change is evenly shared. And I think that on this case, on this second question, Europe does a considerably better job than the United States.
All right.
It has a sense of we're all in this together. It shares equality more broadly, I think, than the U.S.
Okay. Now, there is this trend of technology. There is also another trend that you have spotted, and that is the rise of the so-called artisan economy. And this is what you are going to talk us about. Please.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that artisans, artists, people who worked with their hands, this was the original middle class in the United States and in Europe. And then industrialization comes around in the 1800s, and it sweeps through the economy, and it grinds away a lot of these jobs, these silversmiths and blacksmiths and these woodworkers. Artisans were destroyed in many ways by the Industrial Revolution, which took a lot of people who used to work on farms and then put them in factories where they worked on assembly lines and did the same thing over and over and over. This sort of work was exceptional for efficiency, but it was not very good for autonomy, for creativity. Every worker was a cog in a much larger machine. And so I see history sort of bending back on itself in an interesting way. I think it's possible that, yes, industrialization has taken a lot of these people who used to work in farms or who used to work in artistic jobs and put them in factories, and then as we moved to a services economy, brought them out of factories, and they worked in retail and they worked in food and beverage. But what could happen in the near future, I think, which would be very interesting, is if technology replaced a lot of the jobs we see today and freed up people to have more artistic careers, to remake this artisan economy that thrived before the Industrial Revolution. I think, for example, that online right now, you see a lot of people who are essentially living as cultural producers. They're making videos. They're writing for a living. They are making music. This is the sort of creativity that can be unleashed by technology, by the internet, which in particular makes it so much cheaper to distribute this sort of work. And then finally, I'm really interested in a movement that is very much afoot in the U.S. Called the Makers Movement. I visited, for example, an old factory in Columbus, Ohio, which was sort of like a gymnasium for industrial tools. You could pay a monthly subscription fee to have access to all of these machines that could weld and finish and paint. There were plasma cutters and angle grinders and lathes, and there were painters and there were artists. And it was this enormous space, this cultural space where people who were working part-time or who came there after work could come together and live a sort of wonderfully creative and artistic life. And the reason this is so important, and this goes right back to what Professor McAfee was saying, is that work isn't just about money, it's not just about busyness, it's also about meaning. And we know, both from psychology and from sociology, that it is these sort of creative jobs that provide deep meaning and individuality that people feel the best about themselves when they do. And so I am open to the possibility of pessimism with technological change, but I do see this as a silver lining.
Okay. Derek, a personal question. Do you like beer?
Do I like beer? Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
I asked you this because in America there is a sort of a beer revolution going on with a wave of microbreweries. Is that part of this makers movement, you think?
That's a very interesting question. So it's true. I think that, on the one hand, you did see in the 1990s this fear that everything would be McDonaldized. People talked about McMansions. People talked about sort of the McDonaldization of industry, that everything in the future would look the same. And then history surprised us a bit. And in beer, for example, you do see this rise of microbreweries and local whiskeys and a re-emphasis on finding things that are local and interesting and not broadly mass manufactured. One of the lessons that I take from this is that it's very difficult to anticipate what people are going to want in the future. That 20 years ago we thought everyone would want something that was mass-produced, and then in 15 years it turned out no, people want something that's special. And one thing that I suppose Professor McAfee might agree with is that you can imagine a future in which, yes, there are machine-powered mass manufacturing companies that are making lots of things that aren't that differentiated, that aren't that special, but people might still have a special value attached to something made by a person, made by someone they can touch, someone who is local, something that has a bit of that human touch. And so this is one reason why I think no matter how advanced computing becomes, no matter how many different jobs robots can do and how many games of Go they can win, there will always be a role for people to play, because human consumers love that human touch. They love thinking that the thing that they're buying, the thing that they're getting is something a little bit special, a little bit bespoke, whether it's a fine Italian suit or a wonderful Belgian beer.
Yeah.
So I do forever see a future for people to make these special products.
But of course, all of these initiatives are by their very own nature, they are small. Micro level, microbreweries, we call them in the case of beer. Can they ever have an impact on the economy on the macro level?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. With microbreweries in particular, these are not obviously the best-selling beers in the United States for sure. The best-selling beers in the U.S. are still Budweiser, Bud Light, and other mass-produced light beers. So you do see, if you imagine a long-tail distribution with a fat head, it is the case right now that, yes, the long tail exists, but it's the companies in the fat head that are making the most money. That hasn't changed. But there are thinkers who say that, in the future, as it becomes easier for a company, whether it's a beer company making a physical product or a musician making a digital product, a digital song, that it might be easier for these long tail companies to get to market because the internet is such a wonderful flattener of distribution.
And is this also an example of the fact that people in the future might less and less lend themselves to a company lifelong as a worker and go for their own initiative? As an independent?
This is a very interesting question, right? And I think that, so first of all, it's important to say that the U.S. records for entrepreneurship do not necessarily show rising entrepreneurship. It does, on the one hand, seem like there are new companies starting all the time and so much venture capital money slushing around in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. But at the same time, official government entrepreneurship startup rates do not seem particularly high, historically speaking. The second thing is that one really important reason why people worked at the same company for a long, long time in the middle and maybe toward the end of the 20th century was because unions were so popular in the U.S. private sector. But U.S. unions, particularly in the private sector, have declined from about 35% to closer to 9%. So you've seen a real collapse in the share of unionized workers, which means that there's less keeping people at the same company for a long period of time. So particularly in one's 20s, it's very, very common for people to work for not just 1, 2, 3 companies, but maybe 4, 5, 6 companies, really trying out a lot of different jobs to figure out what sort of fit is best. And there's some evidence that suggests that this is a good thing, that sort of waiting to find your, quote, dream job, or less dreamily, the job where your skills most fit the needs of the company, that there could be a benefit to this, that people who wait a bit to find these jobs end up making more money when they land there. So you're absolutely right. It is true that people are not staying with the same company for a long period of time. But right now it does seem like most of those people still want to be employees. They don't necessarily want to be their own employer. In the future, it'll be very interesting to continue to look at these official government statistics to see, all right, are we seeing an increase in startup rates that might suggest people feel more confident striking out and being their own boss.
Okay, Derek Thompson, thank you very much for sharing these thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.
And from New York, we go to London. Hello, David Rowan.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon. David, ladies and gentlemen, you can see he's a bit gray, but he's still a young man. He is a technology journalist, and he is also editor with Wired magazine. A few years back, he published an in-depth article entitled 8 Lessons from Small Businesses in the Digital Revolution. David, first of all, what is Wired magazine?
We tell the stories about the people building the future, the innovators, the scientists, the entrepreneurs, the technologists, and it's a world of hybrid innovation. Often the transformative companies are the designer comes together with a biochemist, or the architect comes together with a physicist, and innovation is creating those billion-dollar businesses.
Okay, billion-dollar businesses, but of course, most of these guys and girls come together and they start up. They start a startup, and this is what you are going to tell us about, the importance of startup. First of all, to what extent could startups come to dominate the economy?
So we're in a world of, as Andrew said, increasing acceleration. I think the world's never going to move this slowly. And everywhere I look, I see a lot. I go traveling the whole time to the research labs to see the startup pitch conferences, and I'm constantly having to reassess my understanding of what the drone economy is, what robotics is, what biomedical research is giving us. And startups have the great advantage of nothing to lose. Incumbents, the big pharma companies, the big industrial manufacturers, they have legacy, layers of management, and a really, really difficult thing to get over, revenue. So the startups can take the risks. Most of the startups will not succeed, but the few that do can build tremendous growth. If you look at, for instance, in the enterprise messaging world, a company like Slack is growing so quickly it's been called the fastest growth company in history. And at the same time, the startups are able to access the tools that have been newly democratized. And what I mean by this is, because of Moore's law, the cost has collapsed, not just for computing, but in a similar way for sequencing human DNA, in a similar way for producing solar energy. And the cost of manufacture, for instance, has fallen so that you no longer need a factory. You just need to make a 2-minute video with your idea in it and a very, very basic prototype and put it onto Kickstarter. And if the crowd likes it, they will fund you. Then you can get access to factory capacity. And the startup mindset is all about willingness to take risks, an ability to iterate when there's failure, and a certain resilience in the face of opposition, particularly regulatory opposition. The companies that are most effectively changing our behavior are often those that are doing things that they shouldn't really be doing. If you look at the success of companies like Uber and Airbnb, they are having battles in each location they're based with city councils. Even big successful companies like Facebook and Google, they're taking what we would have thought of a couple of years ago as liberties with our own personal data. But they're pushing the boundaries, they're changing consumer expectations and behavior, and the regulators are then having to follow.
So they challenge politics, in fact.
I think, in a way, they lead politics to a certain extent. The speed at which the network adapts a new behavior is often greater than that of the regulators in understanding it. And we see this the whole time. In Brazil, a few days ago, a judge was involved in cancelling a ban on WhatsApp. The government wanted to control one of the most popular social messaging apps that businesses are relying on for leads. It didn't work. There was popular opposition. The courts got involved. I think we're going to hit constant clashes between the innovators and the regulators. For instance, autonomous vehicles. There is strong evidence that they're going to save quite a lot of lives. I think the World Health Organization talks about 1.2 million deaths or injuries each year because of human error on the roads. We know that autonomous vehicles are safer. They are still going to meet friction in terms of the rollout in a lot of cities. And I guess the pressure is going to come from the insurance companies, the health services.
Okay. Another thing, of course, we see happening is that the new giants of the internet economy, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks, are constantly on the lookout for these startups, and they spend millions and millions of dollars in buying them. The risk is then, of course, that the economic power gets concentrated in 4 or 5 of these dominant internet companies now.
So we're not so much in a battle for technology. A lot of technologies have been open sourced. You can even access at zero cost a whole bunch of artificial intelligence technologies. There's one called, I think, Neural Walk that will describe what the computer sees as you're walking along, and words will appear on the screen. Anybody can use this. Mm-hmm. The challenge is access to talent. It's the individuals. And what the big tech companies are doing is buying up the people who understand how to build the networks, how to program the machine. And you do pretty soon get a wholly unfair advantage if you are the company that owns all the machine learning experts, all the computer vision experts, all the extraordinarily talented data scientists. And then you start to be able to apply network effects to the access to and the processing of data. I had dinner last night with a senior executive at one of the big European phone networks, and he was telling me in their internal research labs, they're looking at how much they really know about the intent of each individual customer. And so far, the customer has not given permission for all that data to be used. Mm-hmm. But we were having a theoretical discussion. They know more about you than the search engines, than the government, than your family, because they know your location, what your messages are saying, what you're looking to buy, where you're physically planning to go. And if they could do a deal with you, maybe we'll give you discounted data plans if you'll actively share that data with us. They will have a barrier to entry that no standard business can compete with in terms of understanding what current demand is for what products, how to get those products to the consumer in real time. And I think we're getting to a stage which we were in the 1930s, where the regulators are going to have to step in and act in the interest of the wider business world because of the dominance of 4 or 5 big tech companies.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I have one more question for you, something completely different. I don't know if Wired magazine has a position on the Brexit.
We will still take as many low-cost airplanes to as many events where tech talent is. The interesting thing about a market like Europe, we launched Wired in the UK 7.5 years ago. Everybody was saying, why are you doing that? All the cool stuff's happening in the West Coast. We were optimistic about Europe, and we've been right so far. If you look at Stockholm and Barcelona and Tel Aviv and Paris and Istanbul, Brussels is not yet high on our list, but a lot of the European tech hubs are booming. They're creating international companies with huge valuations, and it's partly because talent can move between them. As I said earlier, innovation comes when there are people with different mindsets, different sets of experiences. And the beautiful thing about a city like London is there will be startups of 40 people from 20 different countries. And that's how you get people to ignore the existing rules.
And does this mean that, in your opinion, Great Britain would be better off within the European Union?
A lot of the entrepreneurs I talk to would be very, very concerned about a move to take Britain out of Europe. Partly the exchange of talent and the ability for people to work in different places without any friction. Partly access to markets. But I'm not a politician. I just tell stories about the crazy ones.
But, okay, but thank you very much for answering these questions. David Rowan, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's try to translate this to our own country, to Belgium.